Welcome everyone to our final TMC seminar of the spring semester. I'm Warren Kinghorn. I'm a co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. We exist in the TMC initiative to connect the world of healthcare with the world of Christian faith and practice, and would encourage any of you who are interested to check out our website at tmc.divinity.duke.edu to see our programs, including our flexible hybrid certificate program where applications are now open for. Consistent with our emphasis on bridging the world of Christian faith and practice with the world of healthcare, it's really my deep pleasure to introduce one of our own as our seminar speaker today. Dr. Wylin Wilson is Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics at Duke Divinity School. She is a graduate of Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. She's an MDiv from the Interdenominational Theological Center, an MS in Agricultural Resource and Managerial Economics from Cornell, and a PhD in Religious Social Ethics from Emory University. Professor Wilson's work lies at the intersection of religion, gender, and bioethics. Her academic interests also include rural bioethics and Black church studies. Prior to joining Duke Divinity School in 2020, she was a teaching faculty member at the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. She's also served as a visiting lecturer and research associate at the Harvard Divinity School Women's Studies and Religion program. Professor Wilson is the former Associate Director of Education at the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics in Research and Healthcare, and former faculty member in the College of Agriculture, Environment, and Nutrition Sciences at Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama. Professor Wilson served on the Mount Auburn Hospital Ethics Committee in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the advisory board for the Rural Child Hunger Summit, and as volunteer spiritual caregiver for the Somerville Cambridge Elder Services in Somerville, Massachusetts. She's a member of the American Academy of Religion's Bioethics and Religion Program Unit Steering Committee, and among her publications is her book, Economic Ethics and the Black Church. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Wilson to you today as she presents to us on the subject, Womanist Bioethics. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Warren and Brendan, for this opportunity, and also to my other colleagues, Far, Brett, Patrick, wonderful colleagues here at Duke Divinity School. I'm just so excited to be here with you today and so excited to present. And it's so good to see longtime friends here as well. So in light of my prior work with African American faith communities in the rural South, trying to address health disparities, and in my broader research, of course, on the intersection of bioethics, gender, and theology, I found myself searching for a response to what I was witnessing in African American communities. And that was the Black women's health crisis in the United States. Various studies demonstrate that across almost every health indicator, African American women fare worse than women in other racial and ethnic groups. And these disparities are quite noticeable during adolescence and continue throughout the rest of their lives. So I constructed womanist bioethics as a response to the Black women's health crisis in this country. Now, womanist bioethics is a theoretical and social change framework that centers the history and everyday experiences of Black women as a way of seeking justice for Black women in health, science, medicine, religion, and environmental contexts. So I am just excited to share with you today some of my work in progress, for sure. This is a manuscript. This is a part of a manuscript that I'm writing that I will be sharing with you. And this is an excerpt from my methodological framework chapter. And I look forward to receiving your feedback. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for the gift of your presence here with me today. So let's dig into this manuscript, right? So Miss Robbie Hall, a proud 58-year-old African-American great-grandmother, praise dancer in worship and peer counselor, works 12-hour days for very little pay in Chino, California. She experienced physical and sexual abuse during her childhood, and during the pandemic, she again found herself facing traumatic situations. See, during the COVID-19 outbreak at a factory where she worked, she contracted the virus and was hospitalized, struggling to breathe. And after her hospitalization, Ms. Hall was left debilitated. She was tethered to an oxygen tank and needing a walker for mobility. Now, unable to return to work, her meager 60 cents an hour, she was not able to earn anymore. So she could no longer purchase basic necessities such as soap and toothpaste. Now, Ms. Hall's employer can legally pay her a miserable wage because, as you may have guessed, she labors in a prison factory. Now, the California prison system kept factories open during the initial height of the pandemic, placing prisoners like Ms. Hall at great risk. She described her experience working the 12-hour shift at the prison factory as being, quote, like a slave factory. The more you give them, the more they won't, end quote. So the California prison system had taken precautionary measures to prohibit the spread of the coronavirus within its facilities in the wake of the virus outbreak in the spring of 2020. They took measures such as suspending rehab programs, suspending religious services, and educational classes. But they failed to take the same precautions within their prison factories where they were making money from producing goods such as furniture and, ironically, masks and hand sanitizer. So Ms. Hall was left defenseless within the prison factory that benefits from her and other women like her minimally paid labor, because the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States, of course, it's at the exception of people who are convicted of crimes. So furthermore, because incarcerated workers are not classified as employees, they of course don't get sick leave or paid time off work. And as the coronavirus began to spread throughout the California prisons and factories continued their production, workers like Ms. Hall feared stopping their work because they, of course, they did not want to contract the virus, but they feared stopping that because they didn't want to lose their jobs for the little bit of pay that they did get. And even worse, they feared losing their release from prison. So I share this story because it's one of many stories of the most vulnerable among vulnerable populations among us in this country. And so for many people, the pandemic actually has exposed the extent of compounded vulnerability of particular individuals like Ms. Hall and communities that many Americans have long ignored, unfortunately. However, the prison populations are not our nation's only neglected communities. Racial and ethnic minorities such as Latinx, Native American, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander, immigrant communities, poor whites, and African Americans within inner cities and in rural areas in the US are some of the many other neglected communities in our nation. So let's take, for example, the rural Southern Black Belt. It's home to some of our poorest citizens, and African Americans predominate among them. And indeed, historically, African American counties are often the poorest of the poor within rural America. And a majority of residents suffer compounded vulnerabilities. And when I say compounded vulnerabilities, meaning, so one, poverty, a second one, if you're facing a health issue, health crisis, a third, say a person is homeless. So compounded vulnerabilities are topped one condition on another that puts a person at a disadvantage. So these counties are filled with individuals who are trapped in a healthcare system that's mired in not only implicit bias, but historical racial discrimination. And the historical racial discrimination is important to point out because the reality is that many of us are only a few generations removed from legalized racial segregation in this country, only 2 or 1 generation removed from that. So the same types of attitudes and all of the ideas that buttress the legalized racial segregation are still very much alive. Unfortunately, they become a part of our cultural scripts in our nation and baked into our cultural scripts. So it's very important to look at the fact that historical racial discrimination is also a part very much of what we continue to see and live with in this country. And individuals also have to deal with the threat of the repeal of gains in healthcare reform. And that looms particularly large in these rural vulnerable populations because there are very few options when it comes to healthcare, right? And these communities also offer limited economic opportunity, and they're therefore areas of persistently high poverty, poor health, very limited medical services. So rural communities often rely on the economic development strategies that attract low-wage industries like meatpacking plants or prisons. And often these industries become a community's primary employer, and as such, they get to call the shots when it comes to wages and working conditions. So in such situations, womanist bioethics actually pushes us to ask, how did we get to the point of neglect and indifference toward the suffering of vulnerable communities and individuals within our nation? That's a big question, right? But I asked the question because I think it's a question that if we are going to move toward justice and move toward liberatory kinds of actions and praxis within the healthcare system and within our society in general, we have to ask these kinds of really kind of hard questions, right? So the power in womanism is that it expands not only the methodology of bioethics, but even more crucially, how bioethical analysis is defined and who are the subjects, right? That's very important. And this expansion of bioethics is significant because lives are at stake, not just the lives of Black women. That's just who I'm using within this text as that's my case study, right? Because I'm narrowing this down so we can hone in and look at one particular vulnerable population. But the lives that are at stake are vulnerable communities throughout the United States. So poor whites in Appalachia and the Missouri Ozarks, Native American Pacific Islander reservations throughout our nation, say out west and the Midwest. So we really want to remember that womanist bioethics is important for all vulnerable populations, but I am today focusing on Black women. So indeed, the notion of vulnerability is at the center of the womanist expansion of the field of bioethics. And central to womanist bioethics is the uncovering and centering of the stories of the most vulnerable of vulnerable populations. Women of color who suffer compounded vulnerability, such as Miss Robbie Hall, for instance, within the carceral system, and rural African-American women who live under the weight of continuous hospital closings and poverty. Now, some of these women, of course, are fortunate enough to find relief through the health activism of Black women within Black churches. But that, of course, as you know, is no substitute for quality, access to quality healthcare in our rural communities. So in addition to centering these narratives of women of color, I will delineate the methodological framework for women's bioethical analysis today and discuss a few of its principles. We don't have enough time to go through all of them, but just I'll hit on a few. We're going to talk about some of its commitments and the foundations of it. And I also want to discuss the prophetic witness of the tradition, the prophetic witness tradition of the Black church, which serves as a great resource for womanist bioethics. So at the heart of the commitments of women's bioethics and principles is this aforementioned concept of vulnerability. So despite vulnerability's centrality to the origins of bioethics within the field, this concept is limited by a lack of clarity, right? So it's kind of problematic there. Western philosophy's neglect of vulnerability has spilled over into mainstream bioethics because of its predominant association with dependency and suffering, which is antithetical to the cultural values of individualism, self-sufficiency, and autonomy, right? But furthermore, the neglect of the body and its defining characteristic of vulnerability is also at odds with moral philosophy's focus on reason and intellect. Likewise, for its association with emotion, which also is marginalized within philosophical discourse, vulnerability is just problematic, right? However, mainstream bioethics, it considers vulnerability, of course, to be too broad and vague a notion to be meaningful, even though the origins of the field arose from the unethical abuse of vulnerable subjects in biomedical research and clinical settings, right? So yes, bioethics finds this concept problematic, but it is absolutely essential to the origins of the field itself. So prioritizing the concept of vulnerability in bioethical analysis, we are then in a sense returning to the roots of the field itself, right? Returning back to bioethics' reason for being as such. So it is a very important concept for us to basically to really just peer into and use on behalf of vulnerable subjects. So by contrast, the significance of vulnerability for womanist bioethics lies in the fact that vulnerability is created through the social, political, and economic conditions in which individuals live. Thus, communities and individuals suffer disadvantage and are vulnerable because of our norms of distinction, privilege, hierarchy, status, and authority that are built into our everyday practices. So these power relations determine that groups of people are treated, say, unfairly or unequally. And for such reasons, vulnerability then is a central concept in womanist bioethical analysis. Thus, a critical analysis of historical norms that influence power relations and the intersecting oppressions in the lives of women of color are among the most important methodological focus of women's bioethics. So I want to now I'm going to outline for you central aspects of the womanist bioethical methodology. And first, the examination of historical and contemporary contexts and experiences of Black women's health status and outcomes. Secondly, the use of Black women's spiritual and cultural values as epistemological building blocks for liberative bioethical discourse and analysis. And so what do I mean then by this liberative discourse and analysis? It is justice seeking and justice centered. right? So it is then focused on salvation from oppressions in order to engage in communal and societal structures that can reinforce and perpetuate community and wholeness and support women of color's spiritual empowerment. Thirdly, this womanist bioethical methodology examines Black women's public health activism, and a good deal of that, of course, has historically taken place and been facilitated by the Black church. It's why the Black church is really a great resource for this. Fourthly, the critical analysis of intersecting oppressions and compounded vulnerability in the lives of women of color, right? The significant task of womenist analysis is to interrogate and deconstruct these structures of oppression, of race, class, gender oppression. Then what we want to do is then uncover and recover and honor women of color's moral wisdom, spiritual resilience, and strategies of resistance, which are often invisibilized by the tentacles of white supremacy that have reached into every aspect of American life historically, right? Including science, health, religion, and politics. So lastly, this methodological focus here, the last thing is social change. So womanist bioethics is also a social change framework. And what it does is it stands on the pillars of womanist social transformation. And there are 4 pillars: dialogue, spirituality, self-determination, and vocation. So the significant aspects of womanist dialogue include standpoint and equality, right? Transparency about one's standpoint and interaction that participants conceive as being between equals, right? And that's foundational. And dialogue, of course, is the site of confrontation and reconciliation. And confrontation, this is understood to take place between equals. Thus, the ethical confrontation is between individuals who have mutual regard for the dignity of the other and who are willing to accept their differences and the resulting standpoints there. So the dialogue is thus marked by a power dynamic, not of domination, but of cooperation and mutual respect. So spirituality, of course, is a source for personal agency and transformation. So in their struggle against multi-layered oppression, Black women have choices that are not bound by accepting limiting roles, right, that may be attributed to them through societal historical discrimination. But African American women's agency, or the ability to draw from culturally based sources that provide new wells for creativity, that is the power within to change oneself and the world around oneself. And so spirituality then is this wellspring for the catalyzation of the agency, resilience, and resistance that animates Black women's self-determination. And so central to this self-determination is speaking up and speaking out prophetically, resisting all that works against women of color's empowerment, right? And then reconstructing historical narratives so that women of color and their communities are remembered, right, to wholeness, exposing false myths and refusing to conspire with their own oppression. Because the reality of living in our nation with this history of racial discrimination and implicit bias, the reality is there is then this internalized racism, internalized bias, and anti-Black bias that then we don't want people of color to then just, live that out, right? So we need wholeness and healing and repairing from that itself. So this remembering and resisting, it is an outgrowth of the vital work that feeds one's soul and enables individuals and communities to flourish. Now, vocation as the fundamental pillar of womanist bioethics social change framework is really significant. And it's one of the ones that is my favorite because one of the joys of actually teaching is actively being able to nurture students' sense of vocation, right? A sense of call to their work or a sense of call to a way of being within their work. And so more students than we might think feel a sense of vocation, most obviously those who enter ministry or training for chaplaincy positions, right? But I found in teaching medical students and healthcare professionals generally that the majority of them also feel a call to either their work as a healthcare provider or they sense a call to being a certain type of healthcare professional, one that adheres to either religious or philosophical principles that prompt them to live out certain virtues within their practice. So, womanist theology and ethics provides this guiding vision for these virtues and values that animate a liberative praxis of healthcare professionals. Thus, women's theology and ethics is foundational to the expansive work that womanism does for mainstream bioethics in general. So I want to take just a minute here to talk about this foundation, right, of womanist theology and ethics. So Black women religious scholars took the term womanism and applied it as a constructive challenge to patriarchy and the abstraction and claims of neutrality and universality of Western theological and philosophical thought. Whereas feminism did not go far enough in the critique of patriarchy, womanism was exactly the framework that Black women religious scholars needed. Because feminist theological and religious scholarship and Black liberation scholarship was devoid of this multi-layered experience of oppression, right? Race, class, and gender. And of course, ability, and we can go on, sexual orientation. But this multi-layered experience of oppression marked Black women's lived experience. And because feminism was associated mainly with white middle-class women's experience, women's theology began as an act of rebellion, right? And this rebellion, it's the kind of rebellion of making good trouble, right? And it begins in ethical analysis. And with ethics, Black women can place their lives in this reflective theological context. So thanks to womanist theology, Black women's lived experience became a site of both hermeneutical activity and of divine revelation and activity, which challenges Western theological and ethical epistemic normativity. So, social, gender, and epistemic normativity are typically defined by white, middle class, middle aged, male, heterosexual, able bodied considerations. And this leads to the invisibilization and exclusion of Black women and other women of color who do not fit these normative social constraints. So womanist theology begins in this ethical reflection, which is based on the text of Black women's lives. So therein, there is the text, right? So you see kind of the difference here, and you see the significance here. So in her foundational text, Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk, Dolores Williams describes the aims of womanist theology as including this discourse work, it's discourse and work with Black women in churches and bringing Black women's experience into discourse of all of Christian theology from which it has previously been excluded. So this discourse and work has recovered narratives of spiritual resilience that yield innovative strategies of resistance to oppression catalyzed by a liberatory moral vision. So unlike mainstream Western theology, which has historically provided fodder for the justification of oppression, women's theology opposes all forms of oppression. And Williams argues that among its primary tasks is to dialogue with the church and other disciplines. And for this reason, women's theology welcomes dialogue with diverse theological voices, from traditional, what we call mainstream, to feminist, Mujerista, Jewish, Asian, African, and even religious nuns. So this womanist theology illustrates the significance of Black women's experience and faith for helping to shape the nature of Black religion, and it challenges all oppressive forces impeding Black women's struggle for survival and for the development of a positive, productive quality of life that's conducive to not only Black women's well-being, but families' well-being, societal well-being. And so the significant resource for womanist bioethics, of course, is this prophetic witness tradition of the Black church, as I mentioned earlier. And so if we look at the story of bioethics, mainstream bioethics, and its relationship to religion and theology, it has gaping holes, particularly with respect to Black communities. Thereby, it makes women's health reform doubly invisible. See, this work that the women of color have been doing with respect to health reform in this country ever since, well, actually before even the legalized racial segregation of even healthcare facilities, the work has been done even before then. And so the experience of rural Black women is especially missing from this history, from this telling of this history. And so even contemporary attempts at health activism within Black faith communities, the work that continues to be performed mainly by female laity, it goes largely unnoticed. And stories about experiencing the healthcare system from the underside, right, remains unheard. And this underside, meaning the lack of access to the best medical care and treatment, adequate medical care and treatment, right? This experience of engaging the healthcare system with one facing the various compounded vulnerabilities. So the media has paid a little more attention during COVID-19 to these largely unnoticed and unheard stories of vulnerable women of color within the healthcare system. But these stories actually share a common historical context. And that common historical context is of course, white supremacy, racism, and the prophetic tradition in the Black church, which has been central to social uplift and self-determination. So I'm going to point out a story for you of kind of an example of this prophetic witness tradition and the Black women's health activism through the Black church. So Reverend Holmes is a middle-aged African-American woman who pastors a congregation that sits immediately adjacent to a landfill in the rural Alabama Black Belt. And the church has had to rely on the parent denomination to keep their bills paid and the building maintained because 75% of Reverend Holmes' congregation is below the poverty line. And they cannot be expected to pay tithes, especially not enough for the upkeep and maintenance of the church itself. So this church could not hold worship services during the hot summer months because of the noxious gases from the landfill, which made it absolutely unbearable, right? And especially in the South, as hot as it gets down here, the local water system is likewise believed to be contaminated as a result of this landfill. But Reverend Holmes mobilized community members and has for over 10 years now fought for environmental justice and individual community members' health. But unfortunately, little has changed. In fact, the local power structure, which is predominantly white power structure, it wields its power to maintain the status quo, and the landfill has become more profitable and actually has expanded its business. But Reverend Holmes and her small African-American congregation continues to mobilize allies in this fight for her community's health. So living with this daily burden of environmental injustice while also living with inadequate access to quality health care, Reverend Holmes and her predominantly female elderly congregation, they know all too well what it means to be on the underside, not only within the healthcare system, but within society at large. So indeed, multitudes of everyday African American women have played this seminal role in the prophetic witness tradition of the Black church. And in fact, the social activist arm of the Black church is a particularly clear manifestation of this prophetic witness tradition and has historically been run predominantly by Black church women. And so these women have long denounced destructive forces of white supremacy that have shaped the relationships within America's religious and other institutions. Forces such as the longstanding societal indifference to Black women's health crises and the broad acceptance of health disparities as normal. Until the pandemic, health disparities almost seemed to become somewhat normalized amongst us. And the pandemic helped to kind of shake us awake, right? And shake us to action. And if to nothing else, just shake us to shock, right? And to be really looking at the fact that this problem, this crisis must be addressed. So disproportionately, many Black church women find themselves living with illness and longing for shalom, the soundness in their bodies and in their communities. And so not only are these women, some of these women are very sick, and this is evidenced by the health disparity statistics, they also are trapped in either carceral or economic or food and healthcare systems that historically are characterized by racism, classism, sexism, right? These multiple layers. And so the history of these systems begins with enslavement and is followed by a labor system in which masses of women of color are among the lowest paid laborers within the economic system. They fill the ranks of those who labor is devalued and marked by menial tasks. So this long-standing relationship that has existed between religion and health has persisted long after slavery within the Black church. And early in the US history, on account of racial discrimination and de facto segregation, which closed off many of our mainstream social institutions to African American, as part of its prophetic witness tradition, the Black church fulfilled not only a spiritual role in communities, but very practical roles. For example, because of the legalized racial segregation in hospitals, which lasted until the 1960s, and if the truth be told, even into the 70s, the 1970s, a lot of hospitals were still segregated even here in the South. But so in the past, because of this, churches have, and many of them continue because of health disparities, to offer things such as free health clinics. They've sponsored health fairs where individuals within the community can get free blood pressure checks, free eye exams, dental exams, consultations with healthcare professionals, and referrals for community health facilities whenever follow-up is needed. So you can see now from the beginning, the goals of the Black church have included, social, political, economic, as well as, the health of Black people, right? So in addition to, this is all in addition to the spiritual well-being. And so making it a vital resource. See, this is what makes this Black church prophetic witness tradition a vital resource for womanist bioethics, which itself is guided by various commitments. So I just want to go over a few commitments of womanist bioethics. So womanism centers this history and everyday experience of Black women and other women of color as a lens through which to see and understand justice and to bring into focus these marginalized voices. The reason why I'm sharing these narratives, because that is a part of what is so important, these narratives that have not been uncovered, right, and discovered. These are very important to womanist bioethical methodology. So it makes a unique contribution to mainstream American bioethics because of these commitments. First, it is committed to, Womanist Bioethics committed to epistemological privileging of the lived experience of women of color and of the health, economic, and social issues they confront. So the commitment is to women as whole persons, and thus to a bioethics that acknowledges all the physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual aspects of womanhood. And so in the womanist approach to bioethics, women of color are its subject of analysis and narrative development. And let me explain what I mean by this. I always like to use this example from when I was teaching at a medical school. And one day I was introducing Paul Farmer and liberation theology to my bioethics students at the med school. And one of my students stopped me and asked, wait a minute. Why is it that we must show a preferential option for the poor? This just seems unjust and unfair to the rest of us. So I answered using insights from Paul Farmer himself, right? That diseases themselves make a preferential option for the poor. Every careful survey across boundaries of time, space shows that poor are at an increased risk of dying prematurely and are sicker than the non-poor. Thus, this option for the poor is against their poverty and therefore also against injustice and inequality that drives their poverty. Thus, the preferential option for the poor challenges not only their poverty, but also their disproportionate burden of suffering injustice and inequality in a world that is by default makes a preferential option for the wealthy. So I use that as an example to say, so therefore, womanist bioethics, this epistemological privileging of women of color and centering their lives and history, it's like this preferential option for the poor in liberation theology. It is a corrective to, not an erasure. It's not an erasure of anything, right? It doesn't erase any other history. We still definitely fulfill the requirements and acknowledge and honor the requirements of our traditional Western philosophical ethics and theology. There's no erasure of that, but it is a corrective to it, right? So it corrects for the default center of mainstream bioethics, which is white, male, middle class, secular, and privileged. So the second commitment is for womenist bioethics, it's committed to resisting the reproduction of reified social conceptualizations of vulnerable populations of women of color that keep them silent, invisible, disempowered, and consider them unworthy, irresponsible objects of scorn and desire. So that's the false tropes of the irresponsible single mother who refuses experimental birth control and sterilization, or the welfare queen who saps the system. These false tropes are replaced with truths about the identity of Black women as worthy, present, responsible individuals. And so womenist bioethics is committed to the truth that Black women are worthy of care and respect regardless of their history and their social and moral status. So a third commitment is that it is committed additionally to advocacy. So advocacy is an imperative for social, economic, medical, and religious institutions to be in right relationship to and do justice on behalf of women of color and other vulnerable populations. So when I use women of color and Black women, and when it's centered in this analysis, we can very easily put other vulnerable populations because womanism is broad that way. But like I said, just for this analysis that I'm doing within this manuscript, it's just focused on Black women. So if we look at, for example, acknowledging that women comprise the majority of caregivers in society, womenist bioethics advocates for and insists on the moral priority of just compensation for caregivers within various institutions, including familial ones in society. And the last commitment is for Black women's spiritual empowerment. Spirituality is this concept that's fundamental to womanism, and thus we prioritize the inclusion of spirituality in attending to Black women's health crisis. And so the manuscript that I'm writing, of course, has a Christian focus, and it reflects the centrality of Black churches and health activism throughout the history of the United States as crucial sites of health education, health screening, health testing. And for instance, it reflects that almost 80% of African American adults identify as Christian, and 75% of them consider religion to be very important. So given these commitments of womanist bioethics, this manuscript, I'm making it makes a contribution, but also makes an audacious claim that the historical and cultural realities themselves of Black women are appropriate lenses through which to analyze bioethical issues and dilemmas within the United States. So the lives of Black women in the US themselves interpret the current state of healthcare and the healthcare system in the US. And so this is a large part of the task of what women's bioethics does. It does this interpretive work through the lens of the lives of women of color and other vulnerable populations with the goal of approaching justice, right? So there are various principles, just like there are principles within mainstream bioethics. What women's bioethics does is it expands those principles and includes additional principles, but we do not have time to go through all of that. But I'll just say some of the additional principles that are included, the principles of autonomy, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, right? But some of the additional ones are spiritual empowerment, wholeness, survival, which, yes, sound very different, right, than what we look at when we talk about mainstream bioethics. But I want to give you just a short story to show you how important these are. So of the thousands of high-risk imprisoned laborers who continued working at the onset of the pandemic last spring, remember Ms. Hall we talked about earlier? She wondered about her safety as she was herself making masks to be sold, right, in the prison factory. She wondered about her safety in contracting the coronavirus. And her story is similar to many incarcerated women. And the growth of women incarcerated in the criminal justice system has increased 7-fold within the past 25 years. And the abuse and trauma are common narratives of these women. And they mainly have experienced violence and intimate partner violence at a higher rate, with 70 to 90% of incarcerated women experiencing this intimate partner violence, as opposed to 35% of non-incarcerated women, 35%. So the physical, sexual, and emotional abuse in childhood and the subsequent violence in adulthood, there are pathways to this incarceration for women. And so Ms. Hall herself, she received her prison sentence for murder of a man that she says raped her and tried to kill her in her early 20s. So amid this economic exploitation during imprisonment, Ms. Hall's activities while in prison illustrate the power of womanist principles of spiritual empowerment and survival, right? Her reputation as a peer counselor, praise dancer in Sunday worship specifically. For Black women, this spiritual empowerment and survival and wholeness are just foundational to what a womanist bioethical conceptualization of healthcare offers, okay? And so wholeness, with its meaning being centered in the restoration of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual soundness or healing, right? Being made whole or complete. Wholeness is a foundational pillar in womanism. So for Black women who've had their identity and economic and health status circumscribed by ideological and social cultural constraints of enslavement, followed by Jim Crow and persistent racial violence, wholeness is a fundamental aspect of physical, mental, and spiritual health, and it's foundational to human flourishing. So a significant step in restoring this wholeness is eradicating racism from our economic, political, and health institutions, racism and implicit bias, right? Because racism has essentially morphed into implicit bias, and all have implicit bias, even African Americans, right? Other people of color, because of internalized racism that has been part of our cultural script. We all have implicit bias. So, what does this wholeness look like for women like Ms. Hall? Well, women's bioethics argues that it looks like a society that actively works to dismantle white supremacy and value all lives, fights against economic exploitation, and exposes cultural myths that uphold the reproduction of abuse and discrimination against Black bodies. So I believe I'm running out of time. Warren, Dr. Kingwell, right?
We have about 8 minutes left, something like that.
Oh, well, fantastic then. Yeah. So I can keep rolling on. Yeah. So I'm very much at the end.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
So is that okay, or do I stop?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, whatever time we have left, we'll take for questions and answers before 5:30. Okay. So.
All righty. So this justification of enslavement and dehumanization of Black bodies early in our nation's history, it was basically precipitated by the pseudoscientific mythologizing that buttressed these beliefs about racial inferiority. And it was reinforced by theological validation. So the beliefs that Blacks did not experience pain, or that disease affected Black bodies differently, all of these beliefs that Blacks were innately pathological, all of these pervaded the American colonial mindset. And white religion in our colonies provided the necessary ideological sinews, arguing that Blacks were cursed and that salvation had no repercussion for physical Black bodies and did not amount to freedom, from enslavement, for instance. So all of these are part of our cultural scripts, right? And so what is central to women's bioethics then is also not just uncovering these myths that hold and trap Black women, Black bodies, and other bodies of color historically, but to analyze the historical power relationships that these myths have helped to establish and perpetuate. So what's necessary is to examine how these myths and power relationships continue to determine our cultural and economic and health, the presuppositions, right? So they legitimate current stereotypes that sanction the enforcement of disregard and discrimination against women and other individuals of color. So Towns argues that we all participate in centering the social reality that influences our health and well-being. And so what we have to do is, because we play a part in this, right? We have to actually look at what these scripts are, look at the perpetuation of them. And we're trying to understand that the wholeness of women of color, Black women, Native American women, Pacific Islander, Asian American women, our wholeness and this nation is something that historically we all have a hand in eroding, whether through our acquiescence to cultural values that uphold patriarchal or racist stereotypes, or by actively perpetuating structural bias and violence against those who are othered, right, in our system. Therefore, all of us within our national community have a hand in creating wholeness for women of color, for vulnerable populations, for all people in our nation. And so we all have a responsibility to resist acquiescence or the active participation in domination and marginalization of those who are othered. And so womanist bioethics calls us to doing this reparative work. Thank you so much for being here.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. Let me encourage you to take about 15 to 20 seconds just to think about what questions you have. I would ask any of you who have questions to go to the reactions icon on the bottom of your toolbar and to click that and to raise your hand, and I will call on you in the order that people raise their hand, and would ask you to unmute and show your screen and ask a question. And we probably have time for maybe 2 to 3 questions. We'll end at 5:30. Let's take about 15 seconds just to think about questions that you have. And as soon as we start seeing hands raised, we'll start to take them.
Oh.
All right. I see Polly Hilsebeck.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. How has Katie Cannon's doing ethics by way of stories of basic Black women's lives influenced your work?
Oh, yes, tremendously. That has been so central to the methodology, the women's methodology that I use, because my background as a social scientist, right? I, kind of been on that side of looking at problems and analyzing problems as a social scientist, which, we're looking at running regression models and, very much looking at quantitative data. But one of the things that I noticed in that work was a lot of the qualitative data that filled in so many of the gaps in the quantitative data that I was analyzing was missing and so important. When I started, going out in the communities, this was years and years ago, right? When I was going out in communities, then I was going as an, agricultural economist, right? And talking to folks in rural America, I was realizing, oh my gosh, wait a minute, this is not captured in my economic theory. This is not captured, in so much, but the stories were so rich and so important in explaining, those kind of unnamed variables and the unknown variable, so much and so much richness in the stories, those narratives within those African American communities. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. It's so central, very central to my work. Thank you, Polly.
Thank you. I think Katie Cannon would be really proud of you.
Oh,
your work.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, and I'd love to ask a question, and this is more of something that I want to ask if I've heard you correctly, because it seems to make a difference for how we teach bioethics. So when you gave the 4 pillars of women and social transformation of dialogue, spirituality, self-determination, and vocation, I started to think, well, if that were just presented just like that with no other context to a group of like pretty privileged medical students or students in general, it could look like something very different than women's bioethics. It could look just like a kind of something that is used by those who are privileged to perpetuate privilege without attention to the broader social context that you're describing. And so it seems that that to think in the terms of women's bioethics can't simply be kind of statements of value, but really has to be a kind of life lived in conversation with and in engagement with the material conditions of people's lives. And I guess I wonder, how does that affect the way that that you teach bioethics, or that you would encourage those in medical education settings or health profession educating settings to teach bioethics?
So thank you. Perfect question. And that is in the book. All that part is in the book. I just couldn't cram it all into today's lecture. But yes, so I use this notion of proximity. That is so significant, because a lot of times, if you just take a few seconds, just right now, right? All of us, think through your professional circles, your social circles, your neighborhood. I mean, just think through these circles, right? And think about the people that are in those circles. Usually they look like us, they are in our similar demographic, similar class, all of this, right? Similar education, all of that. So the proximity, so we're lacking the proximity to folks, the vulnerable populations that we're going to have to be serving, those who are suffering from health disparities, those in rural areas or urban areas, but we're lacking the proximity. And so for me, what I think is so important is to actually encourage that. I remember talking to some of my students in one of my classes in the previous medical school prior to coming here to Duke. One of the students said to me, you know what, I have the opportunity to do, to go and work in a rural setting, in a hospital in a rural setting. And at first I was like, no way, because that's not prestigious. That is not going to get me anywhere, But now, because after we had a couple of lectures, talking about this methodology and what that could look like in our actual, in practice, I was so excited. The students said, you know what? I'm going to take that. I'm not going to worry about prestige, and I'm not going to worry, And so I'm really grateful that, this is something that we can all do, right? We can really practically do this. We can, proximity, right? We can do that. We don't have it in our lives naturally within our social circles and our professional circles, but we can put ourselves in those places. And even once a month, I remember one of the churches that I went to prior to being here in North Carolina. The church every month had it was just a blood pressure check to see if people had high blood pressure. So during that time, the healthcare professionals within the community would come, and that interaction itself was amazing. And it was just once a month, right? And it was just for like an hour on a Sunday after church. And so things like that, even if you just go in once a month into some church that you would never go to, right?
Yeah.
A place that you would never attend or whatever, but just the proximity, putting ourselves in those places where we wouldn't normally be. And they begin to open up the narratives of, and they begin to open us up to, the needs and
Thank you so much. This is really great. We are a couple minutes over our time, so we're going to conclude this session now. With great thanks to all of you who are here. Thank you for joining us, and thanks especially to Dr. Wilson for sharing your work, for sharing conversation. I'm just so delighted that you're a colleague here at Duke. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Go in peace, everyone. Thank you so much.